Welcome, and thank you for joining this Union Live session, Implementing Existing Short Course Regimens While Keeping an Eye on the Future of Treatment Innovation. After 20 plus years of investment in research, we can finally treat TB infection in as little as 1 month and most forms of drug-sensitive and drug-resistant TB in 4 and 6 months, respectively. These regimens are shorter, more potent, and WHO recommended, and yet relatively few people have access to them. A human rights issue that a new civil society-led campaign, the 146 by 24 campaign, which you'll hear more about shortly, hopes to address. At the same time, several phase 3 and 4 treatment shortening trials have recently or are soon poised to present results, including during this conference, with the potential to further transform the TB treatment landscape. And so with our distinguished panel of speakers today, we'll review the existing short course regimens, as well as results from trials of further short course regimens to come, and then we will hear a variety of perspectives, including from community respondents and global and national policymakers. So with that, I'll introduce our first speaker, Lynette Mabote, who is a longtime advisor and consultant with Treatment Action Group. And I'm just gonna queue up Lynette's slides and over to you shortly.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Lynette Mabote, and as Lindsay correctly assumes, I work with the Treatment Action Group on this very critical piece of work. I'm very excited about this campaign. Oh. Okay, so I haven't started. Okay. Oh. This is a very exciting moment in tuberculosis. This is a very exciting moment in tuberculosis. And I think for us as activists, as communities, as people living with the disease, we are very proud to be joining this campaign, the 146 times 24 campaign. It's a campaign to rally energy, political will, and funding to finally end TB. As my co-chair introduced, this session is very important because we're going to be talking about the new regimens that we have, making treatment shorter, more acceptable, more adaptable, as well as more acceptable to communities, as well as to a lot of families. Next slide, please. We ask ourselves the question as to why such a campaign is required. We saw what happened during COVID-19. This pandemic, as well as the concurrent global health, economic and political social crises, rolled back and continue to roll back the progress we have made in the TB response over the last decade. We've missed nearly all of the treatment and prevention targets set during the United Nations high-level TB meeting in 2018. And to be honest, we need something to rally behind that's going to take us from now to the SDGs by 2030 to end tuberculosis. And this is something to rally behind. Everybody's invited to join the campaign, and we're very happy that it is something that any stakeholder is able to join in. As my co-chair mentioned, after 20 years of research, we finally have treatment that is shorter, as little as 1 month, and most forms of for TB preventive therapy, 4 months for drug sensitive, 6 months for DRTB, and people can have their lives back. And these are access issues that are critically important, especially in advancing human rights. The campaign, I will just expand further as to why it's very important, shows you over the slide as to looking at 3 countries where we've had a lot of COVID-19 disruption. So you're looking at countries, you're looking at 3 different slides here, showing you meridians in Indonesia and Kenya, as well as in Ukraine, of the disruptions that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic to the TB response, and what is now happening in terms of case finding, number 1. Number 2, also showing you what happened in terms of preventive therapy. We are in a very bad place where that is concerned. And just over such a short period of time, we really need to make sure that between now and 2030, we leverage as much capacity as possible, political will as possible, to get us to where we need to go. And this is the solution. So what does this campaign mean? We've got one, which stands for 1 month, or once weekly treatment regimen for TB preventive therapy. We've got 4 months for drug-sensitive tuberculosis. We've got 6 months for drug-resistant tuberculosis. And we want to make sure that by the end of 2024, at least at bare minimum, we have all the staff, the space, and the systems and support required in order for us to make shorter treatments a reality. A priority research we still have, of course, is to look at what some of these shorter regimens mean for other risk populations. If we're looking at, for instance, for the 4 months, is we can already think about the children whom we've neglected for a very long time. But of course, with some of the shorter treatments, we will still require a lot of data in order for us to ensure that we aren't excluding anybody. Telling you about this, we are now going to be doing a little bit of treatment literacy. I know a lot of you who are attending this union conference already do know a lot about your treatment literacy, so I'm not going to take a lot of time. Just to mention that in the 4 months, we're now looking at a utilization of rifapentine in our treatment regimen. And of course, when we're looking at 6 months, we're looking at BPAL, looking at betaquilin, pretomanid, linezolid, and moxifloxacin. So this makes basically treatment much shorter, even though we know that upstream, we're going to be facing challenges. We don't know downstream, we're basically coming up with shorter treatments for a lot of our communities. These are the abbreviations. You may, of course, look at them after the segment. Okay, we've got more abbreviations that we wanted you to go through, because we want this to be a treatment literacy slide as much as it is a slide that rallies behind the campaign, because without knowing what the material is, there's no way that you can advocate for it. So as much as you're sitting at home now watching the union conference, you are able to also understand the various abbreviations we have, but also understand why the campaign is so important for you to join. So I'm not going to be going through this slide because we do have our expert who will be speaking to this. My colleague will be speaking after me, Dr. Jennifer Furen. So I will just move over the slide, but just to show you what we had before then, in terms of looking at, for instance, IPT, which was 6 months to 36 months, and now we have literally between 1 to 4 months, one month, as well as 3 HP. Looking at how we've reduced drug-resistant tuberculosis regimens from 18 to 24 months to just 6 months. These revelations and this science has shown us that really between what we had before and what we have now, the 20 years have exceedingly shortened treatment for the better for all of those who are in need. To simplify this further, we now show you a calendar version of what happens in a person's lifetime. So whereas before you would have to take TPT or TB preventive therapy for 6 months, now you only have to take it for 1 month. Or of course, when you are on 3 HP, you'll have to take it for 3 months. But it's still way shorter than having to take treatment for preventive treatment for 9 or to 36 months. When we're looking at drug-sensitive tuberculosis, especially for, as I said, infants and babies, we are looking at 6 months. So we're reducing that time to 4 months. And then when we're looking at drug-resistant tuberculosis, we are looking at a 6-month regimen that is working, that actually some countries are already championing, including the country of South Africa. And we are looking at no more hearing loss, which has been such a crippling effect of DRTB treatment to so many communities over the last century, actually 2 centuries of the response. So what does this mean? I think this means hope Hope is a very important word for us, especially those who have been affected or afflicted or have family members who have been affected by tuberculosis. This means that families can get back to their lives as soon as possible. COVID-19 threw us wayside, and now we can cover economically way sooner. It will also reduce the catastrophic cost of tuberculosis because we are on shorter treatment. Secondly, we will know that we've got more safe, tolerable, and acceptable treatment, leading to fewer interruptions, and also that can also reduce, we will reduce resistance and ensure that we have higher rates of treatment completion and, of course, better outcomes. The human resources are important, not only human resources for health, but will also be human resource savings for health systems. So we are saving and we are strengthening health systems through shortening treatment regimens that are now coming into the market. So, a very dear friend of ours, and a lot of us, I think, who are attending this conference already come with a sad heart, remembering Dr. Paul Farmer, who has been a very long-standing champion of the right to health and the right to science, as well as the right to enjoyment of scientific advancements. Dr. Paul Farmer was an advocate that everybody and anybody had a right to health. This didn't mean whether or not you were rich or poor. It meant everybody, and we did not exclude anyone in society. He said in a quote once that, governments have a duty to make available and accessible to all persons and without discrimination, especially to the most vulnerable, all the best available applications of scientific progress necessary to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of health. Now, these comments are also made in numerous declarations that have been made at the UN level. But I mean, this is something that we need to all be passionate about, and we need to make sure that we are pushing these regimens just for this purpose, to make sure that people aren't dying unnecessarily of tuberculosis. Next slide, please. So what do we mean about STUFF? We basically mean that the campaign is about shortening the treatment regimen courses that I've just gone through. The STUFF that we're talking about, this campaign is making sure that people actually have the stuff that they require in order to reduce the catastrophic cost of tuberculosis, but to also make sure that they are enjoying the full benefits of scientific progress. When we talk about space, we want to make sure that we are living in a world where everybody has got access to life, access to health, access to short-term regimens, and access to point-of-care regimens that actually are working for them. When we're talking about systems, we're talking about system strengthening. And we do know that a lot of effort has gone into health system strengthening, but we want to put a bit more pressure on all stakeholders to ensure that by 2024, we at least have tuberculosis where it was, back on track in terms of moving forward and ensuring that we actually reach 2030, ending it. The inspiration that we have for this campaign is, of course, in what we've seen in the HIV response, where we had the 3x5 initiative by the WHO and UNAIDS, who sought to provide HIV treatment to 3 million people in LMICs by the end of 2005. This happened. So this campaign is to rally that movement to get us back on track to ending tuberculosis. So we need to know that healthcare workers are very important, and we now are struggling a lot with health resources, because we know that a lot of our healthcare workers work throughout the pandemic are not being adequately compensated, also trained actually in terms of the new drugs that are available. So we need to make sure that everybody, including in public, in private, informal, community-based, everybody anywhere has got what is needed in order to move this forward. We need to know that we've got this stuff, including the diagnostic tools. These are point of care tools that we really do need, the consumables, the technologies, medication and equipment, all in place in order for people to be able to test it adequately as well as on time. The space, including at facility, hospital, or at community care through decentralized care to ensure that they are receiving care. The systems need to be placed in that we need policymakers and regulatory mechanisms to make sure that there is active case finding, to make sure that we've got better outreach and referral services. Support, meaning that we need a multi-sectoral response in tuberculosis. It's not only the response of the National TB Program, it's the response to all sectors of society, including all government departments, including all stakeholders, private, public, everybody. It's all of our jobs to make sure that we are providing support in order for us to reach these goals. So the challenge is on in terms of this campaign. What are asks? So some of our asks throughout this campaign will look at asking our government to initiate to expedite uptake of new innovations. We know how long it takes for governments to sometimes do that, but we really want to see a rapid uptake of guidelines. We want to make sure that national strategic plans, essential medicines lists, at least have these shorter regimens in them in order for us to prepare for whatever challenges are ahead of us. Healthcare workers are trained as soon as possible once this happens, and that once that happens, we make sure that we can do the ground up work of doing the demand creation to ensure that we've got people requesting for the treatment. We need to make sure that we've got increase in domestic and international investment in TB programming. We need to leverage legal and other strategies to make sure that we've got access to medicines and TB and diagnostic technologies, but also to human rights barriers. We really need to make sure that this happens, and we hold governments accountable to this by developing patient-centered care models for treatment prevention in order for us to deliver decentralized care through these short regimens. This is what we're asking for the governments. And we also have a few more asks to donors and funders, and this is, of course, increase the money, put the investments where your mouths are. Make sure that you are putting the money towards health system strengthening, to resources, to laboratory infrastructure, as well as to technological needs. Make sure that we are also investing in climate change adaptable tools so that we ensure that we don't have recurrence of TB, and we also ensure that we are working towards a climate change agenda within our TB response. We need to expand new and existing resources of funding for civil society. You are investing in civil society at a national, local, regional level when you do this. And this campaign is calling for this in order for us to hold everybody accountable, including ourselves. And we need to make sure that we're expanding resources and capacity to accelerate research and also fill those gaps that are required in order for us to make sure that we aren't leaving anybody behind with this campaign and with what we're trying to do with the short regimens. The asks that we have from big pharmaceutical companies and diagnostics companies is to ensure that they actually are developing fit for purpose diagnostic tools and formulations. This includes fixed dose combinations and formulations that are appropriate for children. We need to ensure that we've got fit for purpose technologies. We need to make sure that we've got rapid molecular tests to detect tuberculosis in a shorter time frame, as well as to make sure that we are looking at resistance of key medicines, including rifampicin, isoniazid, fluoroquinolones, and bedaquiline at the point of care. We need to make sure that we are already putting a lot of pressure on our national regulatory authorities to make sure that they are actually submitting the right dossiers to WHO for pre-qualification, but also at national level to make sure that there's fast tracking of dossiers of these shorter regimens. We need to commit to transparency, evidence-based pricing determined by cost of goods sold. So this is to pharmaceutical pharmaceutical companies to let us know what a reasonable profit margin would be, and to make sure that we've got no patent enforcement, because these are global public goods. There should be no patent on these, and we basically need transparency in order for us to make sure that we meet their needs as well. We also need to make sure that we are, addressing our outstanding research needs. Next slide, please. So we are now working with networks and institutions, and we are very excited to say that we are already seeing a lot of work being done in implementation science, in science that's trying to navigate a very, of course, complicated space of TB. But there are remaining research and data gaps, and we hope we have a lot of funding for this. We also want to advance fit-for-purpose quantitative and qualitative research to support the scale-up and adaptability of these short-term regimens at a local level. We want to ensure that the regimens are safe in terms of dosing and optimization, of course, for people living with HIV, for young adolescents, children, and pregnant people. We want to make sure that we are evaluating risk factors or populations that would benefit from treatment extensions, evaluate preferences for target populations, as well as invest in developing better point-of-care diagnostic tools, as well as a TB vaccine, which is coming up. We just need to make sure that we are holding steadfast, and this is that opportunity for us through this campaign. So there are many opportunities and next steps. Number one, we welcome everybody to join. Nobody is left out. We want to take stock of where we are actually within the national responses. I think this is very important for us to do. And this is a message to everybody who does a lot of advocacy around tuberculosis, to ask ourselves, why are we not doing this? What are the constraints that are facing us, even at government level or at local level? We want to elevate this campaign not only to the attention of the health ministers, but also to the attention of presidents and other duty bearers to make sure that we have enough advocacy and communication tools, that we are making this a political commitment that addresses the barriers. So we need to ask our questions, where are these barriers at national level? The third one is to look at how do we develop national strategic plans that already have these regimens installed in them, even though they are not ready necessarily to implement them by 2024? And how do we do this quickly? We want to look at what happens at national research and research budget appropriations. How do we get this involved? And how do we get members of parliament involved in doing this with us? We're looking at, of course, working at the Global Fund portfolio optimization or catalytic investments, looking at the upcoming NFM4 and the timeframes that we need to speak to CCMs in order for them to prioritize these these new regimens. And we want to make sure that we've got all stakeholders at national level, at regional level, at international level, just rallying behind the 146 times 24 campaign. So there are many resources that we'd like to share, and these are available because, as we said, these are WHO affiliated resources. So we'd like you to please try me, scan your phone over there, have as many resources as you need, but do join this campaign and let's make this a reality. Let us end TB by 2030. Over, thank you. I now hand over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Jennifer Furen. Over.
Thank you, Lynette. But before, I was just going to give a short introduction of Dr. Jennifer, if everybody can hear me. Dr. Jennifer is an infectious diseases clinician and a medical anthropologist who focuses on global health. She's a lecturer on global health and social medicine at the Harvard Medical School. And Dr. Jennifer, you will present the highlights from the regimen shortening trial results that are being presented at this week's Union conference. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Vim, and thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. Great. Thank you for this opportunity. I am going to try to quickly talk about some really important science that's being presented at the Union Conference in the TB space. And, I think this feeds in nicely with the 1x4x6x24 campaign because it is science that got us those shorter regimens, and we need to always keep trying to be doing better when it comes to people who are impacted by TB. The title of the talk for me is More Options for People with TB, or Are We Falling Back into this idea of a pan regimen? And just before I speak, I do want to mention that I received grant funding from the Stop TB Partnership's Global Drug Facility to support the rollout of child-friendly. And these are very exciting times in TB. I think for the first time, we have more high-quality science, which means we actually have better data to drive treatment making. And I'm going to be presenting my understanding of two trials that were presented earlier this week, STREAM 2 and TRUNCATE. They're both important randomized trials and can help us understand approaches building TB treatment, but also for how to build clinical trials capacity in the TB space, and they have important ramifications for the community. The discussion that I want to present here is based on, I attended these sessions live, and I encourage all of you to listen to sessions if you haven't been able to. I want to share some of the slides from those sessions, but also some of my impressions from the presentation and Q&A and discussion. So TRUNCATE TB is really what we call a proof of concept study. It's a very early study, everyone. This is not a study that we're going to take the results and go out and start. But it was a proof of concept study that basically said everybody with TB gets the same treatment. But maybe we don't need to give everybody the same duration of treatment, and maybe we're treating everybody for now based on preventing relapse or recurrence in a very. So the idea, the proof of concept was to say, can we shorten treatment even further? From 6 months to 4 months, is it possible to do it in 8 weeks? And they used a very novel trial design, something that's AMS trial, that allowed them to start with a number of regimens. And then as those regimens performed and were assessed during the course of the study, they could drop treatment. There were a lot of logistical challenges that drove decision making in this study, and they started with 4 potential regimens to try to get down to an 8-week comparison, and they only really took 2 of them forward compared to the 6-month standard of care. And the trial was centered largely in Southeast Asia, although there was a small number of participants in Uganda, and there was not a single person living. So I think the key here is these results do not have any implication on treatment right now, but they will drive the research agenda in the next few years. And this study was also important. It did include a very basic assessment of acceptability to people who are impacted by the disease. These were the 8-week regimens that were tested. They included 5 drugs given for 8 weeks, and they included not only the first-line drugs, but some of them also included second-line drugs, including linezolid, clofazimine, the quinolones, and bedaquiline, and they tended to use higher doses of rifampicin. Only 2 of the arms went forward, as I mentioned. One was high-dose rifampicin combined with linezolid. The other was bedaquiline combined with linezolid. And they enrolled a total of 675 people, just so that people are aware of this. When they took the 8-week regimen that had high doses of rifampicin and linezolid and compared it with the standard treatment, it did not meet the criteria that they specified at the beginning that would allow it to be considered non-inferior. So that regimen was not successful. But when they looked at the 8-week arm in which bedaquiline and linezolid were both included and compared an 8-week regimen to the 6-month standard of care regimen, that regimen did meet the non-inferiority criteria, meaning that it has some potential to shorten treatment for drug-susceptible TB to 8 weeks. So again, very early study, proof of concept, needs to be studied further. And then this was just a slide showing that the safety measures that were assessed in this study showed similar safety with the 8-week regimen of bedaquiline and linezolid combined with first drugs and standard of care. I do want to briefly mention, however, as is always the case, anytime we use drugs, there's a chance that we will select for resistance. And in the 8-week arm, 2 participants did have strains of TB that acquired resistance to the medications that were used. So as with anything, there will be resistance that we need to think about and assess. But this is a potentially interesting idea that we could shorten TB further, and more research needs to be. Briefly, just want to talk about STREAM. Many of you are familiar with STREAM 1, which was a randomized controlled trial of what was called Bangladesh regimen back then. But STREAM 2 actually served as the phase 3 trial for bedaquiline, and it assessed bedaquiline in that 9-month 7-drug regimen where they used bedaquiline instead of the injectable. But the Stream 2 investigators also assessed a 6-month regimen in which the injectable was retained for 8 weeks and bedaquiline was added to that. So I want to mention that Stream 2 took place under difficult circumstances where the standard of care was changing, but it led to the dropout of a very large enrolling country, which was South Africa. And the study was powered actually to compare these 2 different regimens, the all-oral 9-month regimen and the 6-month regimen in which niacin was 8 weeks. The study was designed to compare that to the 9-month regimen that contained the injectable instead of bedaquiline, just so that people are aware of that. The study was not designed to compare the 6-month regimen with the all-oral 9-month regimen, and that is a very important. The study did look at adverse event monitoring. They only reported on grade 3 and 4 serious adverse events, and they did try to do a cost effectiveness assessment, but I will comment that the costs were largely driven by the cost of bedaquiline, and there were no assessments in or the preferences of treatment. These were the Stream Stage 2 regimens. And then the baseline characteristics of the population. It was a relatively young population. About a third of the participants had what would be considered mild disease. About 15% were people. And when they compared the control regimen, which is the 9-month regimen that consists of niacin, with the all-oral bedaquiline regimen, what they found is that the bedaquiline regimen was superior to the 9-month regimen that was injectable. And they also found that the 6-month regimen that contained both bedaquiline and 8 weeks of also superior to the 9-month injectable, both in terms of efficacy. So the summary of the Stream Stage 2 results showed the efficacy of both the all-oral regimen and the 6-month regimen. And they were also found to be safe. The thing that's getting everybody hyped up, but that I want to mention was just an exploratory analysis, is that when they compared the 6-month injectable regimen with the all-oral 9-month regimen, it looked like the 6-month regimen had better outcomes, but the study was not really powered or that comparison. And so there were safety assessments on the injectable that have an. So just very briefly, because I know we don't have a lot of time left, the discussion that happened around these, and again, I encourage everybody to listen to those, is this idea of a pan-TB regimen is coming up again. Everyone's saying, well, if you can use bedaquiline for drug-susceptible TB, and that's part of the BPALM regimen, now we can have a regimen for everybody with TB and have no option. And then the other option that was mentioned with the 6-month injectable containing regimen, the discussion in the Stream presentation was that this could be an option that programs want to consider. So we sort of have like two vying views on these things. But what I would say is important for the impacted community to be aware of is that the pace of clinical trials in TB has largely meant that a lot of the study issues are irrelevant. Right, a 7-drug regimen, whether it be 6 months or 9 months, is not really appealing in terms of. The other thing I'll mention is that in TB, we've come a long way. You know, back in 2015, 2016, no good evidentiary standard. Many of us pushed to roll out bedaquiline and other drugs in the setting of very low quality data. But now we do finally have phase 3 data. We just have to get more sophisticated in how we understand. And the problem that I'm seeing and that I'm a little bit worried about is everyone's going to compare the 6-month injectable regimen with the all-oral 9-month regimen. A study was not that, and we can't truncate is interesting in terms of how it will guide future studies, but the truncate 8-week regimen is nowhere ready to roll out into. So let's just be careful with how we overinterpret that. And just remember that what we really need to start focusing on the clinical trials now is understanding and documenting the preferences and people who are living with the disease The fact that we don't do this in trials means that everyone who's deciding what communities need are people who are paying for trials, designing trials, or designing programs, and those are not the voices that we need to. I think the impacted community is very, very concerned about a push to go back to injectable therapy, and I think that an injectable is not ethical, feasible, or acceptable today. And I also think we want to be careful about what happens in trials. They always perform better than real-world program conditions, which is why we need control groups. Nix was exciting, Xenix was exciting, but they did not include a control group. And now is the Stream 2 regimen that included injectable, had 90% treatment success rates. And so just be careful. We need to have good careful about what we're controlling. But I think more than anything, we need to stay away from this regimen and continue to push for differentiated models of service delivery based on the preferences are impacted by. And I'll stop there and hand over to them and others to introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you. That was great. This all these important points to consider regarding these trial results that coming out. We'll now have two community respondents who will give the point of view from the community on these results. The first is Yulia Kalancha. Yulia is the Executive Director of TB Europe Coalition, TBC, based in Ukraine. And the second community person who will intervene is Shapal Mekra, and Shapal is a public health specialist who works in the areas of infectious diseases like TB and HIV, and he is associated with Survivors Against TB in India. So Yulia, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Wim. Hello, dear participants. I'm happy to be part of the session and represent here the voice of civil society and TB community from the WHO Europe region. As Wim said, my name is Yulia Kalancha. I'm the Executive Director of the TB Europe Coalition, the network which aims to strengthen the role of civil society within the regional response to TB and ensure political and financial commitment to end TB. I'm originally from Ukraine, and unfortunately, Ukraine is currently experiencing unprecedented power and internet cuts due to a brutal and full-scale attack by Russia on our country. Thus, there can be some issues with connection, and I'm apologizing about it in advance. So we are living in a very exciting time in TB research and development, with consortium working on TB treatment, development, utilizing the new classes of drugs, advancing through clinical development, and TB vaccine candidates entering phase 3 trials, when options can be provided for doctors to operate with shortened regimens containing medications with fewer unpleasant side effects, which undoubtedly will make their fight with TB an easier task. When such shorter treatment regimes can make a significant contribution in overcoming stigma and discrimination. The work of teams to make shorter regimes a reality should force changes that were long overdue and will mean that success to better care is still possible even in the hardest of times for countries like Ukraine. However, we must recognize that despite advancement in medical science, TB-affected communities continue to live with poor access to TB care and often have their rights to science and health ignored. If everyone has the right to access scientific advancement and the highest quality of healthcare available, where are our efforts to improve the spread of those tools? When progress with shortened regime can exactly reach those who need them, it is crucial for civil society and TB-affected communities to engage globally with governments, funders, and technical agencies to ensure that these positive changes announced are adopted into national guidelines as soon as possible, and that the necessary drugs are made accessible and available to all to make this a realistic treatment option for those living with TB. Because we know that TB somewhere is TB everywhere and should not be neglected to a concern for low and middle income countries. In the same way that countries swiftly responded to COVID-19 with international collaboration to provide access to together to ensure that monopoly high prices of TB treatment can be challenged, including through patent examination, and made accessible to everyone, shortened treatment regimens to reduce inequity and ensure no one left behind. As we are preparing for the next UNHLM, civil society and TB-affected community can use this opportunity to encourage TB to remain high on the political agenda and to keep their governments accountable for the previous commitments. Shortened regimens can have a life-changing impact in ending TB in such unstable and insecure settings we are living now. And as civil society, we can take our steps to bring this reality faster and closer to people with TB and to improve people's continued access to better care. Thank you very much, and over to my colleague.
Thank you, Julia. Chapal, please go ahead.
Thank you, Wim. Thank you, Julia. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be speaking to all of you, all the delegates, survivors, and community members from India. In countries like India, and really in many other low-income and high-burden TB countries, which remain the hub of drug-sensitive and drug-resistant TB, the possibility of access to shorter, less toxic regimens without injectables comes not just as welcome news, but as relief to millions of people fighting TB. That having been said, even today, there is no clear roadmap in India and in many other countries as to when these regimens will be made available easily, both in the public but also in the private sector. As you know, millions in India and in many other LMICs continue to seek TB care and treatment in the private sector, where both diagnosis and treatment are expensive, unregulated, and without patient support. In this scenario, the possibility of shorter treatment is not just exciting, it's a game changer for millions that continue to fight TB. However, at this point, we still do not have a roadmap for millions of people in these countries for access and for procurement. I want to turn back a little and refer to what my colleague said earlier. The world struggled with COVID-19 and it impacted TB gravely. Yet compare the action taken on COVID-19 and now that has been taken on TB. There is a world of difference. We lack an access strategy. We see inaction on these issues. And this doesn't just signify a lack of concern or inaction, but it is really disregarding the most vulnerable and disempowered TB affected communities. In fact, it is a denial, in a sense, of the suffering of the lives of millions of these individuals. To put it bluntly, this lack of access is not just discrimination against the vulnerable, it is actually violence against the poorest and most vulnerable communities that need access to shorter regimens. There is no justification for continued delays on this. In my view, it sort of violates all principles of human rights, equity, and public health. And at this point, one has to consider the power dynamics that exist, the people who control the access to these regimens. These regimens are controlled by TB programs, which are largely led by cisgender, upper caste, entitled folks and establishment, whose counter-argument often is based on economics and ease. The question is, why do they not apply these arguments to their lives? Why only to the lives of the vulnerable folks who are asking for these treatments? Even today, in countries, it will take months, if not years, even after approval, when these drugs will be made available. There will be no procurement that will be done systematically. So we need to invest in procurement system. We need to invest in training. We need to invest in actually communities participating in the distribution and acceptance of these new regimens. But we are very, very far away from it even now. It's also unacceptable that these regimens in many cases remain very highly priced, controlled, and benefiting pharmaceutical companies that are based in the West, while these diseases primarily devastate poor and vulnerable social economic sort of countries that are minorities in the South. I mean, to term it bluntly, this is profiteering from the lives of the most vulnerable communities, not just in countries like India, but anywhere. I want to end by saying this conference provides us opportunities to think about and talk about these matters. But what we really need is a clear and unambiguous call to end these toxic and lengthy regimens in TB. You know, a lot of throat clearing is great, but it's time to take action, because you cannot say you work for us while you seem to work against us. You have to end this violence, you have to end this discrimination, and you have to end what is nothing short of a deadly divide between the realities and what actually is happening on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Chapelle, and thank you, Julia, for these important interventions and what it means for communities. Our next panelist is Dr. Patrick Lungu. He is the director of the National TB and Leprosy Program in Zambia, and he's going to give us the national policymaker view on these exciting new results. Dr. Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. As introduced by the session chair, I'm Dr. Lungu Patrick, the National TB and Leprosy Program Manager for Zambia. Besides the TB program, I serve on a number of committees, one of them being the TPT Steering Committee. I also co-chair the USAID TB Conduct Investigation. Colleagues, I would like just to begin by commending you, the civil society, for this great initiative. Let me also appreciate the WHO for being proactive in looking out for information, and also as soon as the information is available to make recommendations to countries to adopt. The discussion that we are having in itself is very, very important in the sense that it speaks to one of the pillars of the NTB strategy, which in itself is actually tracking and speaking to treating 90% of individuals with TB effectively. So with that, dear colleagues, I'd like just to say that both the shorter treatment regimens for TB infection as well as for active TB disease are welcome by us policymakers, as it in itself enhances our goals of treating all our patients with TB effectively and equally at the same time preventing TB more effectively. That said, I would like just to say that the current formulations, both the shorter regimens for TPT as well as the shorter treatment regimens for drug-resistant TB, speak to a patient-centered approach. But I would like just to say that while there's a great need for these newer molecules, there's equally hesitance to uptake, and also there are barriers as well to accessing these valuable newer formulations that are life-saving. And the barriers partly come as a result of cost. And at times, even when cost is affordable, there's also another barrier, which is challenging to us policymakers in the sense that we may make policies to adopt these molecules, yet the drug availability remains a challenge. We need to unplug these challenges, and this in itself calls for concerted effort at global level so that we bring about equity to these drugs. Let me cite the issue of 3HP. 3HP has been on the market for 2 to 3 years now, but it's not yet readily available, and the demand for 3HP is overwhelming. A number of countries have adopted it, but yet have not yet accessed it. So we need to make it easy for policymakers by making these drugs available. Let me also cite another challenges that us policymakers do face, the issue of post-adopting these newer regimen, the capacity to now implement. So we need support from bodies such as the WHO and other global level bodies such as the TB Union in building capacity for us to absorb these newer regimens. One of them I would like to cite is the new formulations for children. And already we are facing one challenge at program level implementation, which is defining which children have lesser or mild disease. So that in itself may become a barrier, a technical barrier in absorbing the shorter treatment regimen for children. The other issue, ladies and gentlemen, which also brings about hesitance is also knowledge and engagement of policymakers. to some extent, policymakers may not be fully engaged. Perhaps I think it's about calling upon for global coalitions to start engaging the policymakers a bit more proactively and a bit more actively. So I'd like to end there by saying that we need to put up global actions that are set, that will put up mechanisms for easy absorption of the normative guidance from WHO. Indeed, the science is novel, and indeed the science is sound. We therefore need to accelerate the absorption of the newer formulations, both for TPT and that of MDR, as well as for drug-sensitive TB. We need also to bring about clarity for DRTB treatment in terms of the TPT. There's some missing information on approaches to TPT as which one is the best regimen. So I would like to make a call that more studies be made available or be done to bring about clarity in this area. Last but not the least is to call for multinational studies for which already you start to engage policymakers from the onset. Otherwise, from the policy side, we are very much pleased with the global proactiveness in the space of bringing about newer molecules for both prevention and treatment of both drug-susceptible TB and drug-resistant TB. I would like just to end once again by commending and appreciating the WHO for the steps that have made, equally the scientists as well, who have made this information available for us policymakers to implement and to make decisions. Last but not the least, I commend the civil society for being proactive in this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patrick. And yeah, you highlighted some very important issues to think of for national policymakers and for global policymakers. A lot of food for thought there. Our next and last panelist is Dr. Fouad Mirzayev, who works at the WHO Global TB Program since 2004, I believe. Initially, he was involved in the work related to MDR-TB and the Green Light Committee, and more recently, he's working in the unit called TB Laboratories, Diagnostics and Drug Resistance. Dr. Fouad, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Wim. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, very well.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. Very interesting perspectives and speakers. So I will provide a little bit of our perspective from the team in WHO. And just to start, I want to say that in recent years, we definitely see more outcomes from TB-focused research, both for diagnostics, prevention, and treatment, which is a long-awaited and crucial development for TB community and everyone in this community. However, to see the future perspective clearly, we sometimes need to look into our present and in the recent past. There are new and shorter treatment regimens leading to significant reduction in the duration of preventive therapy, the treatment of drug-susceptible TB and drug-resistant TB. For the first time in the TB treatment history, probably, the duration of the drug-susceptible, drug-resistant TB treatment can be the same. WHO always values collaboration from research partners and is really keen to have early conversation and confidential data sharing to help prepare for the policy development and policy change. As you may know, the development of the WHO recommendations is meticulous, complex, and sometimes lengthy process, also strictly controlled and regulated by the specific for WHO, the Science Division and the Guideline Review Committee. It necessitates the availability of the best available evidence, sometimes additional analysis if it is necessary to align with the key questions posed, and the review by the external guideline development group of experts convened based on thorough analysis of conflicts of interest and balanced by gender and by regional representation. Last year, we had a particularly fruitful collaborations with US CDC on the results of the so-called Study 31 trial and with University College London on the results of the so-called SHINE trial, results of both trials leading to the new recommendations for the shorter 4-month regimens for treatment of drug-susceptible TB. We are planning to release the updated guidelines and the operational handbook on drug-resistant TB treatment before end of this year, so it's fairly imminent. The guidelines will include the new recommendation on the BPAL-M regimen and also update the recommendations on the 9-month regimen. These updates are based on the results of the recently completed trials, the TB Practical, led by MSF, and Zinix, led by TB Alliance. I would like to commend these partners for sharing the data from these trials with WHO prior to the publication of the trial results to help accelerate the development of new recommendations. Also important to highlight is the data that was presented during this conference that Jennifer spoke about earlier, including on the STREAM Stage 2 trial that supports the current WHO recommendation on the use of the all-oral 9-month regimen. Now, let me focus on the future perspective. There are several ongoing trials that may generate new and actionable evidence in the next few years. There are several major research partnerships that have been formed, something that haven't seen before, like PAN-TB and Unite for TB partnerships that will move the field of research in TB forward in the longer perspective. The developments of the new regimens with better efficacy, shorter duration, and improved safety as major components is what the TB community is striving for, and the research is finally paving the way towards these goals. I want to also share a few upcoming developments of possible interest from our team in WHO. We, together with a group of experts, are currently working on the update of the target regimen profiles document. This updated document will convey and update views on the main characteristics of the future TB treatment regimens, including the same duration, efficacy, safety, among other parameters that can be considered by researchers and drug manufacturers. The release is planned early Q2 next year. In addition to the target regimen profiles, WHO is planning to develop the guidance on evidence generation to clarify the main characteristics of the evidence that would best match the requirements of the currently adopted by the organization process of development of the new policies, so-called GREAT process. We're also about to launch a new individual patient data platform, which is a major effort together with our partner, University College London. This platform is destined to host observational, operational research and programmatic data in one database, and we also plan to create a space for storing the data from major phase 3 randomized controlled trials on TB treatment. The main idea behind of this new IPD platform is to make this data available both for WHO policy development and for the researchers worldwide, and potentially stimulate research in TB treatment. To close what I wanted to say, I just want to reiterate that future looks very promising, but we should continue to push for more research and more focus on better and safer prevention, diagnosis, and curative treatment, and hopefully for the vaccine as well, to make sure that we can reach the goals of the NTB strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fuad. Also very important highlights that you were making here. I don't think we have time for question and answer, so I will just end the session here, saying that it was very important to hear all the different stakeholders talk about the results that are exciting, but will definitely warrant a lot more discussion about the pros and cons and the trade-offs to be made in the future. But it's exciting that after so many years, we have so much evidence to look at and so many trial results, phase 3 trials results to analyze, and that will guide us, and that the science can then lead to policy, as we heard from Dr. Lungu as well. It needs to be translated quickly into policy so that the people can benefit from it. And otherwise, this is a human rights issue, as we heard in the beginning. So with that said, I would like to thank all the speakers, all the panelists, also all the participants online, and I wish you a very good continuation of the conference still. Have Have a good evening, afternoon, day. Bye-bye.